Prince Louis is only 8 years old, and yet something has shifted, visibly, publicly, and according to sources, deliberately. Most coverage missed what was actually happening beneath the surface. Because this isn't just about a child growing up.
Prince Louis is clearly a delightful character. He's full of energies. He clearly finds these photo opportunities very exciting.
It's about two senior royals, Prince William and Princess Anne, stepping forward together to confirm something about Louis's future that neither would do lightly. That combination alone should tell you everything about how serious this actually is. So what exactly did they confirm, and why does it require both of them? On the morning of June 17, 2026, Prince William and Princess Anne appeared together. No prepared statement circulated to the usual contacts, just two senior royals, side by side, in a setting sources describe as deliberately chosen for its formality. And what they confirmed about Prince Louis stopped people in that room completely. Here's what you need to understand about why this matters. Joint appearances between William and Anne are genuinely rare. These are two people from entirely different generational positions within this family, with different institutional roles and almost no overlapping public brief. When they appear together, sources say, it means something has happened that cannot be managed through normal channels. So the question everyone immediately started asking was obvious. What, specifically, required both of them? The answer, sources suggest, comes in two parts. The first is about what happened to Louis. The second, the part the palace is handling far more carefully, is about what that event has now set in motion. One is a security matter. The other is something closer to a constitutional one. That separation between incident and consequence is actually where this story lives, because sources close to the palace say this wasn't just a protective announcement, it was a deliberate, coordinated move, the first in a sequence. What kind of child were they making this decision about? That question matters more than it might seem. Now, before you can understand why this decision carries the weight it does, you need to understand exactly who Louis is, because the stakes of withdrawing him aren't abstract. Sources close to the family describe Prince Louis as genuinely unlike either of his siblings, where George carries the weight of succession visibly, and Charlotte has learned to modulate her public presence with remarkable precision for her age. Louis has been something else entirely. Unfiltered, spontaneous, the child who pulled faces at Trooping the Color while millions watched, who covered his ears during flypasts, who made the balcony feel human in a way royal protocol rarely allows. That's not accidental. Sources suggest William and Catherine deliberately shielded him from formal royal conditioning longer than the other two. By design, he was the one allowed to just be a child. And then, quietly, something shifted. At the June 2026 Trooping the Color, observers noticed immediately. The silly faces were gone. Louis stood straight, composed, serious. Some read it as growing up. Sources say it was something else. What changed between that child and this moment? The answer begins with a breach nobody was supposed to know about. Now, here is where the story stops being about a child growing up. Sources say the incident occurred sometime in the spring of 2026 inside a restricted access corridor within a protected royal residence, not a public-facing wing, not a ceremonial space, an internal passage that, by every operational protocol, should have been sealed to anyone outside the immediate protection detail. Someone got through anyway. Sources suggest the individual was not identified in real time. That is the part that matters most. Security personnel only became aware of the proximity when reviewing closed-circuit footage after the fact, which means there was a window, however brief, during which Louis was physically close to an unknown person with no authorized presence in that location, and nobody knew. How does that happen inside one of the most secured environments in Britain? That is exactly what the subsequent internal review asked. The answer, sources say, pointed not to a dramatic external breach, but to something quieter and more unsettling. A procedural gap, a handoff moment between two protection teams where the overlap was assumed rather than confirmed. One party believed the other had the corridor sealed. Neither did. That gap lasted approximately 4 minutes, according to sources familiar with the review's findings. 4 minutes is nothing in ordinary life. Inside a royal protection framework, 4 minutes is a catastrophic window. What made the internal review findings more alarming than the incident itself was a separate detail that surfaced during the investigation. Sources suggest this was not the first anomaly flagged at this specific access point. There had been an earlier irregularity, months prior, that was logged, noted, and then quietly filed rather than escalated. Someone made a judgment call that it did not warrant urgent attention. That judgment call is now the fault line running underneath everything that followed. Because once William saw the review, the question was no longer whether Louis had been in danger. The question became, who saw this coming and said nothing? And what happened next, behind a closed door with Princess Anne sitting across the table, was not a discussion. It was a reckoning. Now, the door to that briefing room was not open to many people. Sources suggest it was a small gathering, deliberately small. William, Anne, 2 senior protection officers, and a palace legal advisor. No aides taking minutes. No press secretary. Nothing that would create a paper trail beyond what was strictly necessary. That choice, sources say, was intentional. William arrived already knowing the conclusions of the internal review. He had read it twice, and sources suggest that when he sat down, he was not there to debate findings. He was there to convert them into a decision. The controlled fury is the part that people who have seen William under pressure describe consistently. It is not loud. It does not raise a room's temperature in the way you might expect from a man who has just discovered his youngest child was placed in proximity to an unknown individual through a breach that had been flagged and quietly buried. It goes cold, precise, deliberate. Anne sat across from him and said very little in the early part of the meeting. Sources say that was not passivity. That was Anne operating exactly as she always has, absorbing, calculating, waiting for the moment her words would carry maximum weight rather than simply fill silence. That moment came when the protection officers began outlining the options, because there were, technically, options: enhanced protocols, revised access controls, an expanded security perimeter at future engagements, the kind of layered response that looks comprehensive on paper and genuinely addresses the procedural failure. Anne dismissed it. Sources suggest her exact framing was something close to this, that no protocol enhancement can compensate for a failure of judgment that already happened once and was ignored. That the question was not how to make the next engagement safer. The question was whether Lewis should be at the next engagement at all. And that, sources say, was the moment the room shifted. William did not argue with her. He agreed. Formally, quietly, and completely. The decision to withdraw Louis from all major public appearances was not put to a vote. It was stated by William, with Anne present as institutional witness. The legal advisor confirmed it could be managed without a public announcement, triggering immediate press speculation, at least initially. But here is what makes that decision extraordinary. Anne has spent 7 decades in this institution, never once prioritizing sentiment over duty. She did not pull her own children back. She did not soften her own exposure. So the question that lingers is this: what exactly did Anne see in that review that made her break her own pattern? And here is where the story stops being about a security breach and starts being about something much older. Princess Anne does not intervene. That is not a characterization. It is a documented institutional reality built across 7 decades of royal service. She has attended more than 4,000 official engagements. She has operated under her own security threats, including a kidnapping attempt in 1974 that she handled with a composure that became palace legend. She did not withdraw. She did not reduce her footprint. She returned to duty. So when sources say Anne not only attended that briefing room but spoke the confirmation aloud, gave it institutional voice, that is not a small thing. That is, sources suggest, genuinely unprecedented for a situation involving a child who is not her own. The question worth asking is this: why her? Why not a private secretary, a senior protection officer, a legal counsel? All of those people were present. Any one of them could have formalized the decision. But there is a reason it needed to be Anne specifically, and sources say it comes down to one word: legitimacy. William, as Louis's father and heir apparent, carries emotional weight in that room. His agreement matters, but it can be second-guessed later, reframed as a father's panic, a protective instinct that outpaced sound judgment. Anne's presence cannot be reframed that way. When Anne speaks to institutional necessity, it closes the door on revisionism. It makes the decision unreachable by sentiment, including William's own, later if he wavers. And that, sources say, is precisely what happened. Anne did not break her pattern out of grief or sympathy. She broke it because the review showed something that made the institutional risk calculation change completely. Not the breach itself, something inside the breach, a detail that hasn't surfaced publicly, which means William walked out of that room carrying 2 things simultaneously: a formal decision and a truth about his son that no palace statement is going to contain. So how does a man hold both of those at once? That question isn't rhetorical. Sources suggest it sat with William for days after that meeting, unresolved, because the answer requires him to be 2 completely different people simultaneously. And here is where the internal fracture becomes genuinely complicated. William, the heir, understands the calculus cold. Public withdrawal from a child triggers a specific kind of press scrutiny, weakness narratives, speculation, the suggestion that something is being hidden. He lived through enough of his parents' strategic communications disasters to know that silence gets filled, always, and usually not in your favor. The institutional side of him recognizes that every month, Louis disappears from balcony photographs. Someone is writing a story about why. But William the father carries something the institution cannot account for. He watched, at close range, what sustained royal exposure does to a child, what it costs, how it shapes you in ways that only surface decades later. Sources say that awareness is not abstract for him. It is, genuinely, the defining lens through which he has made every single decision about his children's public lives since George was born. The two positions are not reconcilable, not cleanly. What sources suggest happened internally is that William did not choose one over the other. He let the institution's logic carry the formal decision, the withdrawal, while privately holding the weight of what triggered it. That unspoken detail from inside the breach, the thing Anne's intervention sealed into permanence, that separation, sources say, is deliberate, and it is also unsustainable, because there is someone else in this equation who has been completely silent since that briefing room meeting ended. Someone who approved the engagement where this breach occurred. Someone who received assurances from protection officers that she believed and acted on. Catherine hasn't spoken publicly. She hasn't issued a statement. She hasn't appeared alongside William or Anne. And sources say that silence is not absence. It is something much heavier than that. And that silence is the part sources say nobody inside the palace knows how to address. Catherine approved the engagement. That is the detail that has been quietly circulating since the briefing room meeting closed. She received assurances from the protection officers assigned to that event. Specific assurances, sources say, about access points, personnel screening, and perimeter integrity. She asked the questions a responsible parent asks. She was told what she needed to hear, and she signed off. The breach happened anyway. Now there is a particular kind of guilt that comes not from recklessness, but from trust, from doing everything correctly and still being wrong. Sources suggest Catherine is not replaying a moment of carelessness. She is replaying a moment of reasonable confidence that the system she believed in simply failed to honor. And that distinction, as devastating as it is, changes nothing about the outcome for Louis. Sources close to the situation describe Catherine's current posture as one of deliberate withdrawal from the formal decision-making process around Louis's protection, not because she has been excluded, but because she genuinely cannot separate her own judgment, the judgment that cleared that engagement, from every subsequent conversation about his safety. William carries the fury, Anne carries the institutional authority. Catherine, sources say, is carrying something neither of them can share. She is replaying a decision she made in good faith that led to a moment she cannot undo, and the question now isn't whether her trust was reasonable. The question is what that breach actually means for Louis's life going forward. And the question isn't abstract anymore. It has a concrete shape, a list of dates, appearances, and ceremonies, and next to each one, a gap where Louis's name used to be. Sources say the withdrawal is not symbolic, it is structural. Balcony appearances at Trooping the Color, carriage processions, the kinds of set-piece moments that have defined Louis's public identity since he was old enough to pull faces at the crowd. All of it, sources suggest, now subject to a security review so thorough it effectively amounts to indefinite suspension. That is what withdrawal actually means. Not a pause, not a quiet reduction, a complete removal from choreographed public exposure until the protection framework around him can be rebuilt from the ground up. Now, does historical precedent exist for this? The honest answer is almost nothing comparable. Sources point to rare moments. Peter Phillips and Zara Tindall were quietly kept from major public engagements during specific threat periods in the 1980s, when IRA activity made royal children genuine targets. But even then, the withdrawal was managed without formal confirmation from senior royals. It happened quietly, deniably, without the institutional weight of two senior family members stepping forward together to confirm it. What William and Anne did is genuinely different, and that difference is the tell, because when you step back and look at what a joint confirmation actually signals, not just privately, but institutionally, it means the decision has passed beyond personal parental choice into something the palace itself is now formally endorsing. Sources suggest that is deliberate, a message to protection officers, to household staff, to anyone inside the perimeter who might push back. This is not a request. This is settled. But here is what sources are now suggesting. Quietly, not everyone inside that perimeter agrees. Not everyone believes withdrawal is the right answer, or that it sends the message William and Anne intend. And the voice pushing back, sources say, is coming from somewhere nobody expected. But not everyone inside that perimeter agrees. And sources say the pushback is coming from somewhere genuinely unexpected, not from Camilla's camp, not from a disgruntled courtier, but from within William's own household structure. A senior communications advisor, embedded with the Wales household for several years and quietly responsible for some of its most sensitive public positioning, raised a formal objection. Not loudly, not through the press, through proper internal channels. A written note delivered directly to William's private secretary in the days following the briefing room decision. The objection was not emotional, it was strategic. The argument, a visible, unexplained withdrawal of Lewis from upcoming public appearances, creates exactly the kind of vacuum that speculation floods, that the palace would be handing the press a story without giving them any shape to put around it. That silence, in this specific case, does not protect, it amplifies. That argument is not wrong. Sources suggest it landed badly anyway, because what William and Anne have concluded, according to people familiar with their thinking, is that managing perception is now a secondary concern. The primary concern is the physical perimeter around a 6-year-old boy. Anyone inside the household who cannot prioritize in that order is, sources suggest, now being viewed very differently. The objection was noted, it was not acted on, but it created a fault line, and fault lines in palace environments have a way of finding the surface eventually, which raises the question nobody inside is yet willing to answer out loud. How did this breach happen in the first place? And does that objection actually know something the inner circle doesn't? So here is the question that every other answer in this story has been quietly circling. Not why William and Anne stepped forward together. Not why Catherine has gone silent. Not even why the internal objection was raised and then ignored. The question underneath all of those is simpler and more uncomfortable than any of them. Who failed? Someone inside a protected environment, with clearance, with proximity, with institutional trust, allowed a breach to occur around a 6-year-old child. Sources suggest the internal review identified a procedural failure within 48 hours. What sources are considerably less clear about is whether that review identified a person or whether it quietly concluded that the failure was systemic, distributed, and therefore conveniently no one's specific fault. And that distinction matters enormously because a single person can be removed. A systemic failure requires admitting the entire protective architecture needs rebuilding. Sources suggest the palace is not yet ready to say that out loud. What William and Anne's joint confirmation actually signaled, when you strip away every layer of institutional language, is that they no longer trust the current framework to hold. That is not a statement about one incident. That is a verdict on a structure. The objector from inside, the one voice still pushing back, sources suggest, may understand exactly what that verdict implies about where the failure actually originated, and why naming it clearly would point somewhere the palace genuinely cannot afford to look. That question remains open. It will not stay quiet forever. The real story isn't about Lewis. It's about William and Anne tightening the circle. Louis is the winner only in that he remains protected. The monarchy's image is the quiet loser. The question nobody's answered yet, who decided he was ready to be seen differently? Call it the controlled reveal.